Hello, I'm Pastor Paul Camuti. I'm a pastor at Real Church in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And I want to welcome you to another segment of Restoration. A few weeks ago it was reported in Colorado that teachers and students were protesting because a conservative school board was elected and they wanted to include civics, patriotism, and American exceptionalism to be taught in the school curriculum. The teachers and the students were protesting because they were afraid that the conservative school board was going to censor out any negative aspects of American history, such as slavery and the maltreatment of American Indians. However, from the accounts that I have found out about, it only seems that the conservative school board wanted to include what I mentioned about civics, patriotism, and American exceptionalism. From what I know, it didn't seem like they wanted to exclude the negative aspects like slavery or what happened to the American Indians. But I have seen report after report where high school students and college students typically will blame all the world's problems on America, past and present. And that's because the educational system in America has largely taken on a decidedly secular progressive viewpoint which casts America in a negative light. Now, I have no problem with teaching the negative aspects of American history. We did have slavery, and it nearly destroyed our nation before we were even 100 years old. And of course, there were wrong things done to American Indians. There's no doubt about it. However, the truth of the matter is, this nation was not built on the backs of slaves and on genocide as what is typically presented to students throughout American classrooms. And I just want to ask something to the protesting teachers and to the protesting students and to like-minded people that think the same way they do, who cry censorship. Who is really doing the censoring? What I'm about to share is historically documented and a matter of public record. And so I want to say again, who is doing the censoring? So let's take a look at slavery, the history of slavery. Slavery was a blight in this country's history. There's no doubt about it. And it is truly one of the saddest parts of our history. However, in 1773, just 3 years prior to the Declaration of Independence being written and signed, Pennsylvania passed a law to help end slavery in its state or in its commonwealth. Several other colonies also passed laws to try to end slavery. But being a colony of Great Britain, King George III vetoed all American laws to put an end to slavery. So contrary to what is popularly taught today, that the founders were slave-owning racists, an overwhelming majority of the founders were opposed to slavery. In fact, a majority of founders didn't even own slaves. Now, it is true that George Washington himself, the father of our country, was a slave owner. In fact, he had 300 slaves. But what they don't tell you is this. What you haven't taught and learned is this, that he didn't buy any of those slaves from the slave trade. He inherited them from family members who passed on and left those slaves to him in their wills. Now, George Washington himself set his slaves free in his last will and testament. When he died, all of his slaves were set free. That was the only way slaves could be set free in the state of Virginia or in the Commonwealth of Virginia with Virginia law. While alive, George Washington said this, "I can only say that there is not a man living who wishes more sincerely than I to see the plan adopted for the abolition of slavery." Thomas Jefferson, himself a slave owner, introduced a bill in the Virginia Assembly designed to end slavery. Unfortunately, there were some founders in states or commonwealths such as Virginia, North and South Carolina, and Georgia who favored slavery. However, again as stated, the overwhelming majority of the founders were opposed to slavery and did not even own slaves. So you may ask me, why didn't men of influence such as George Washington and Thomas Jefferson just set their slaves free as to set an example? The answer to that question is that America had just fought a war for 7 years to win independence from the world power of that day, Great Britain. That would be the equivalent of a nation like Iceland fighting a war with America today. With slavery being such a volatile issue, the split between the North and the South at that time would have been catastrophic. All Congress could do initially was pass bills that would not allow slavery in territories that would eventually become states when they joined the Union. It's easy from our perspective to look back a few hundred years ago and judge men like Washington and Jefferson and say they didn't do enough. But how can we judge them when we have no clue as to how it was to be in their shoes at the time that they lived, trying to get a nation up off the ground at the time that they were doing it? Now let's take a look at the Indian situation. William Bradford was a pilgrim who was involved with the Pilgrim settlement in Plymouth, Massachusetts. He later went on to become governor there. William Bradford wrote that for the first 50 years between the Pilgrims and the American Indians, they lived together peaceably. He also wrote that towards the end of the 50 years, as new settlers from Europe came, he began to lament the changes that were taking place in the relationship between the Indians and the settlers. I've also found 3 American Indian websites that verify that there was peace for 50 years, the first 50 years between the Native American Indians and the Pilgrims. Also, what's largely overlooked or even completely ignored is that in the early settlement days of our nation, religious leaders and colonialists, they purchased land from American Indians that American Indians set the price for. Such was the case with the Pilgrims at Plymouth, the Puritans with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the New Haven Colony, which later became Connecticut, Pennsylvania's, and others. Much of Long Island, where I'm originally from, was purchased by settlers from American Native Indians. Not to mention the Louisiana Purchase. When Thomas Jefferson was president of America, he purchased the Louisiana Territory from the French. The French settled the Louisiana Territory and claimed it for France in the late 1600s, early 1700s. They coexisted with the Native American Indians peaceably. They did a lot of trading with the Indians, which is probably how they acquired much of that territory from the Native American Indians. Later on, the French gave that territory to Spain, and after a number of years, Spain gave it back to the French. And as I mentioned earlier, Thomas Jefferson, when he was president, bought the Louisiana Territory from France. Now listen to this. That territory, the Louisiana Territory, later became 15 states. Those states included Louisiana, Arkansas, Iowa, Colorado, Kansas, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, Nebraska, New Mexico, North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma, Texas, and Wyoming. That section of America alone is more than 1/3 of the continuous 48 states, and that land was purchased. Also in 1992, when America celebrated its 500th anniversary of Christopher Columbus discovering the New World, I came across an article that was written in the then magazine TV Guide. I've tried to relocate that article on the internet and been unsuccessful, and I wish I could have. But this article was written by an American Indian college professor. And this is what he had to say. He went on to write that white American Christians were not the worst nightmare of the American Indian. He said long before white settlers came to America, various Indian nations fought wars against one another. He said that many times stronger Indian nations conquered weaker Indian nations and dispossessed them from their lands, and oftentimes made the weaker Indian nations into slaves. They also practiced cannibalism. He went on to say that America was hardly the paradise for Indians that historians have been trying to make it appear to be before the white man came. In the founding era, Congress passed laws to protect Indians and their lands. After the founders passed on, from the 1830s onward, the government policies towards Indians changed. Is it a coincidence that it was from the 1830s onward that our nation also started to become more influenced by secular Europe? And that also included the church being influenced by secular Europe when the policies of the Indians started to change as well? Is that a coincidence? Have you ever taught or learned how the revivals of the First Great Awakening influenced America's move of independence from Great Britain? Have you ever taught or learned how the Second Great Awakening impacted American culture? Charles Finney, a Christian evangelist, one of the leading figures of the Second Great Awakening, spearheaded the abolitionist movement in this country, fought for women's rights, and other positive things that influenced our culture and our freedoms. Don't tell me the religious aspect of our nation can't be taught because of separation of church and state. Because the Christian and religious aspect of our nation is inseparable from our nation's history. That's a fact. That's the truth. So teachers and students of Colorado and people that are like-minded with them, are you willing to tell this part of American history? Are you willing to even have honest debate as to whether this is true or not? Or are you going to hide behind the separation of church and state argument, which in reality has no bearing whatsoever when it comes to our history as a nation? If you are not willing to debate this honestly, if you are going to hide behind separation of church and state, if you are not willing to tell this part of American history, then dear teachers and students of Colorado and dear like-minded people, you are guilty of the same thing that you're accusing the conservative school board of: censorship. Not only that, but worse yet, you are guilty of unbridled hypocrisy. Until next time, God save America.